Okay, let's unpack this. We are grabbing chapter 43 from Harper's Illustrated Biochemistry, which is uh, essentially the instruction manual for your entire digestive system.
It really is.
We're doing a deep dive into the very foundation of human metabolism,
Hmm.
the precise choreography of nutrition, digestion, and absorption.
And our mission today is to connect those, fundamental chemical reactions to the so what of human health. The simple fact is, the diet has to provide water, fuel, proteins, all of it.
All the building blocks.
Exactly. But the delivery system is highly complex. Those massive molecules, polysaccharides, triacylglycerols, proteins, they all have to be broken down or hydrolyzed into these tiny absorbable units.
Right, like monosaccharides, fatty acids, and amino acids.
Mm-hmm. And if that hydrolysis process fails, the whole system just grinds to a halt.
And the importance of this pathway is so clear when you look at the global context. You have this terrible paradox. On one side, massive undernutrition in many populations, leading to impaired growth and defective immune systems.
Right.
Things like vitamin A, iron, and iodine deficiencies are a huge concern.
Right. And you contrast that with what we see in the developed world.
Yeah.
Excessive food consumption leading directly to chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease.
It's the two extremes of the same problem.
Exactly. Both problems are rooted in the biochemistry of intake, either too little of the right things or far too much of the wrong ones.
And when these highly regulated systems fail, the clinical consequences are, well, they're immediate and they're dramatic.
Absolutely. We see stomach ulcers, often driven by H. pylori plus excess gastric acid. We see gallstones, which is really just cholesterol crystallizing because the bile composition is slightly off.
Yeah.
And if the pancreas fails, say from cystic fibrosis, you get steatorrhea. That's severe fat malabsorption. We'll also get into how absorbing peptides that are too large can trigger massive immune reactions, which is the whole basis of celiac disease. Precision is everything.
Let's start with carbohydrates then, the largest fuel source for most people. The key, as you said, is hydrolysis chopping massive starches into mono and disaccharides.
And the speed at which this happens is so vital, we actually track it using the glycemic index, or GI.
Right, the GI.
It's a measure of how quickly a food raises your blood sugar, and it's standardized against pure glucose, which is defined as 100%.
What's interesting is how the structure influences this speed.
It really is. Take table sugar, sucrose, or even fructose. They all have a lower GI than, say, pure glucose itself.
So foods with a low GI cause less fluctuation in insulin secretion, which is generally considered healthier over the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about the breakdown itself. It starts immediately with amylase.
That's right. Salivary and pancreatic amylases are the main chain breakers. They catalyze this random hydrolysis of the internal alpha-1,4 glycoside bonds in starch.
So they're just attacking the main polymer chain, but not the branches.
Exactly. So what you're left with is this mix of intermediate bits, dextrins, maltose, and those small branched dextrins.
But that's only partial credit, right? The final job happens right at the door of the intestinal cells.
Right at the door. It's handled by the desiderases.
Okay.
These enzymes like maltase, sucrase isomaltase, lactase, they're physically embedded right on the brush border of the mucosal cells. They're the final quality control checkpoint.
And this leads us to the classic clinical story, lactase deficiency, lactose intolerance.
Yeah. For most humans, lactase activity naturally drops off a cliff after weaning. If you consume lactose, then it just sits in the lumen.
And the bacteria have a party.
They do. They ferment it into lactate and gas, and the osmotic pull of that undigested lactose causes water to rush in, and there you have it. Discomfort and diarrhea.
What's fascinating is the distribution. Being able to drink milk as an adult is, well, it's really only common in descendants of specific populations like Northern Europeans.
Right, and some nomadic sub-Saharan African tribes. For most of the world, developing lactose intolerance is just the biological default. It's a great example of evolution meeting biochemistry.
So once we have these final sugars, how do they actually get into the bloodstream? The text describes two fundamentally different mechanisms.
And this distinction is vital. Glucose and galactose are treated as high priority. They're absorbed using a sodium-dependent active transport system.
So the body is spending energy to pull them in.
A lot of energy. It's coupled to the cell's main sodium-potassium pump, allowing the cell to move glucose against its concentration gradient, ensuring maximum uptake.
But fructose gets the second-class treatment.
It does. Fructose and sugar alcohols are absorbed passively through carrier-mediated diffusion. Since it's not active, fructose can only move down its concentration gradient.
So if you have too much at once.
It doesn't get absorbed fast enough, it lingers, and osmotic diarrhea again. The body will work hard for glucose, but fructose is taken casually.
And the exit is simple. They all leave the cell via the GLUT2 transporter. A neat solution.
Very neat.
Okay, let's switch gears entirely now. The hydrophobic challenge. Lipids. Triacylglycerols are oil. Our body is water. How do you transport oil through water?
That is the core chemical puzzle. The body solves it by first hydrolyzing the fats and then packaging the products into these tiny, water-soluble spheres called micelles.
Little transport pods.
Exactly, only about 4 to 6 nanometers wide. And this is also how we absorb the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. They just dissolve inside these micelles.
Which means a very low-fat diet could actually impair your vitamin absorption.
Severely. The enzymatic attack starts with lingual and gastric lipases, which cleave the SN3 bond. This forms 1,2-diacylglycerols and some free fatty acids, which themselves start acting as emulsifiers.
But the main powerhouse is pancreatic lipase.
This enzyme is highly specific. It only attacks positions 1 and 3, and it needs a critical partner protein called colipase to work. The major end product is the 2-monoacylglycerol and free fatty acids.
And that enzyme specificity is why we have drugs that can block it for obesity treatment.
It's a very precise target. Now, to form the micelles themselves, you need bile salts from the liver. They create the transport vehicles. And crucially, the bile salts themselves are recycled. They're mostly absorbed farther down in the ileum and sent back to the liver through the enterohepatic circulation.
Okay, so once the fat products are inside the intestinal cell, the logistics get complicated again. They're immediately restructured.
They have to be. Short and medium-chain fatty acids are simple. They go right into the hepatic portal vein, just like sugars.
But not the long-chain ones?
No, they're immediately reacylated back into triacylglycerols via the monoacylglycerol pathway.
And these rebuilt large fat molecules, they can't use the front door. They have to take the scenic route.
That's a perfect way to put it. They are packaged up along with absorbed cholesterol into these giant lipoprotein particles called chylomicrons.
And they're just too big for the capillaries.
Way too big. So they get secreted into the lymphatic system, bypassing the liver at first, and only entering the bloodstream much later via the thoracic duct. It's a completely different pathway.
Speaking of absorption, let's talk about cholesterol in those plant sterols.
Dietary cholesterol is absorbed in micelles and then mostly re-esterified. But plant sterols and stanols compete for that esterification process.
Because they're not good at it.
They're poor substrates. And because the body can't esterify them, they get actively transported back out of the cell into the lumen. This competition and forced exit effectively lowers the total cholesterol it gets packaged.
Let's pivot to proteins. These are tough, complex molecules. The first challenge is just making them vulnerable to enzymes.
And that vulnerability comes from denaturation, either cooking heat or, critically, the acid in your stomach. Once they're unfolded, the body unleashes this extensive proteolytic toolkit.
The heavy hitters, endopeptidases.
Right. They hydrolyze internal bonds. Pepsin likes bulky side chains. Trypsin likes basic amino acids. Chymotrypsin targets aromatics.
And then you have the external clippers.
The exapeptidases, like carboxypeptidases and aminopeptidases, which just cleave off one amino acid at a time from the ends.
And this whole army of enzymes needs a safety switch, right? The zymogen cascade.
It's a perfect protection mechanism. These powerful enzymes are secreted as inactive precursors called zymogens, so they don't digest the organs that make them.
Smart.
Very. Pepsinogen is activated by gastric acid, but the pancreatic enzymes are only activated once they're safely in the small intestine. Trypsinogen is activated by enteropeptidase.
And once you have active trypsin,
It's the master key. It sets off a chain reaction, activating all the other zymogens, a controlled release.
so on absorption, the end products are free amino acids plus antripeptides.
And both are absorbed. Free amino acids use multiple specific sodium-dependent active transporters. They actually compete with each other for uptake.
And the small peptides.
They enter the cells intact, but they're immediately hydrolyzed inside to amino acids before entering the portal vein.
And here's that clinical correlation again. You mentioned large peptides and allergies.
I did. While the goal is to break everything down, some relatively large peptides can sneak through the mucosal lining. And if they're large enough to stimulate antibody formation,
Your immune system sees an invader.
and you have the basis for an allergic reaction. That is the exact mechanism for the immune response to wheat gluten in celiac disease.
Okay, let's move on to micronutrients. Vitamins and minerals. Fat-soluble ones go with the lipid micelles, but water-soluble ones need specialized systems.
Right. Vitamin B12 is the classic example. It has to bind to intrinsic factor to be absorbed. And calcium absorption is completely dependent on vitamin D.
How does vitamin D regulate that?
Vitamin D literally builds the highway for calcium. It induces the synthesis of an intracellular calcium-binding protein called calbindin,
So it's building the machinery.
and it rapidly recruits existing calcium transporters to the cell surface. Without enough vitamin D, the machinery needed to pull calcium efficiently from the gut just isn't there.
And what stops calcium absorption?
A few things. Phytic acid, found in cereals, binds calcium into insoluble salts. Also, if you have fat malabsorption, the excess fatty acids can bind calcium.
Let's discuss iron. It's perhaps the most tightly regulated mineral in the body, for good reason.
The reason is toxicity. Excess iron salts can generate highly damaging free radicals. Plus, about 10% of the population is genetically predisposed to hemochromatosis or iron overload.
So the body keeps absorption very low.
Right, only about 10% of what you eat. And hepcidin is the master governor protecting us.
It's the emergency brake.
It is. Iron enters the mucosal cell via a specific transporter. Inside, it's bound to ferritin as a safety measure. The only way out is through a protein called ferroportin.
Where does hepcidin fit into this chain?
Hepcidin, which is a peptide from the liver, monitors your iron reserves. If reserves are adequate, the liver pumps out hepcidin. Hepcidin then actively downregulates the gene for ferroportin. It locks the exit door.
So no more iron gets into the bloodstream.
Exactly. But if you become anemic or hypoxic, the liver reduces hepcidin, which unlocks ferroportin, and absorption immediately increases.
That is an elegant feedback loop. And what about enhancers? Vitamin C.
Iron is absorbed in its reduced F2 plus state.
Yeah.
Vitamin C is the most effective reducing agent. Even 25 to 50 milligrams per meal can significantly boost absorption.
Yeah, and the flip side.
Calcium, especially from milk. It strongly impairs the absorption of both inorganic and heme iron.
Okay, let's shift focus now to energy balance. We measure energy expenditure indirectly, usually by monitoring oxygen consumption.
Right, because about 20 kilojoules of energy are expended per liter of oxygen consumed. And we can tell what fuel the body is burning using the respiratory quotient, or RQ.
That's the ratio of CO2 produced to O2 consumed.
Yep, it tells you the fuel mix, fat, carbs, or protein.
And for total expenditure, we have that clever technique with dual isotopically labeled water.
The H2O18, it's brilliant. The hydrogen is only lost in water, but the oxygen 18 is lost in both water and CO2. By measuring the difference in their disappearance rates, you can estimate total CO2 production over days or weeks.
The baseline for all of this is the basal metabolic rate, or BMR. We know it decreases as we age.
That decrease is metabolic realism. It's mostly due to the slow replacement of highly active muscle tissue with less active adipose tissue.
We also see an increase in metabolic rate after a meal. Diet-induced thermogenesis.
That's the energy cost of stocking the pantry. It's the energy needed to synthesize your reserves, glycogen, triacylglycerol, and new proteins.
Let's end this section by looking at the extremes of negative energy balance, marasmus and kwashiorkor.
Marasmus is the result of prolonged, simple starvation.
Right.
It causes extreme emaciation. The body is in a slow, managed conservation mode.
But kwashiorkor is different. It's unique to children, and it's marked by edema and a fatty liver.
This is where it gets really interesting. Kwashiorkor is often triggered by an infection. Instead of slow conservation, the body triggers a costly, accelerated resource waste driven by inflammation. The text suggests a deficiency in antioxidant nutrients zinc, copper, vitamin C, and E.
And the hypermetabolism of cachexia, seen in cancer or AIDS, is even more wasteful.
Correct. Instead of slowing the engine down, the body turns the engine up to maximum and starts burning the chassis. Patients are hypermetabolic. The loss of body protein is massive because cytokines activate the ATP-dependent ubiquitin proteasome pathway.
Wait, the body is actively tagging its own muscle protein for immediate shredding. Why is that such a waste of energy?
It is a massive waste. Ubiquitin is a tag that marks proteins for destruction. This inflammation forces catabolism, which requires huge amounts of ATP. On top of that, there's costly gluconeogenesis from lactate and futile cycling of lipids. The body is just designed to run hot and waste resources in that state.
Our final segment. Protein requirements, measured using nitrogen balance.
Right. Nitrogen in versus nitrogen out. A healthy adult is in equilibrium. Growth or recovery is positive nitrogen balance. Trauma or infection is negative nitrogen balance.
And the requirement is actually quite low. something like 0.66 grams per kilogram. The main need for things like muscle gain is simply more energy, not necessarily tons more protein.
But the quality matters tremendously. Protein requirements are really about getting the right proportions of amino acids. We need 9 specific ones, the essential or indispensable amino acids.
If your meal lacks even one of those essential building blocks, the entire protein synthesis process just stalls.
It becomes the bottleneck. You can't maintain nitrogen balance no matter how much total protein you consume.
We've covered a vast amount of ground here.
Mm.
From precise hydrolysis to lipids taking the scenic route via chylomicrons, and that extremely tight regulatory checkpoint of the hepcidin-ferroportin axis.
And clarifying that the massive differences in malnutrition marasmus being slow conservation, cachexia being rapid, wasteful hypermetabolism, are driven by inflammatory signals. The maintenance of health is entirely dependent on this elegant series of molecular decisions.
Here's where it gets really interesting then. Given the complexity of mineral absorption and competition like calcium inhibiting iron or phytic acid binding zinc, how profoundly does the quality and deliberate combination of the foods you eat affect optimal health and longevity?
This raises an important question. It suggests that nutritional science is ultimately less about counting isolated vitamins and more about understanding synergistic biochemistry and the logistics of competitive molecular transport.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.